can you tell us about when socialist and or communist assaults to education in America, when did this begin, who was behind it, what was the goal?
Well, the communist assault on education began when the communist Robert Owen first proposed the idea that the government ought to educate our children. There's this radical misconception among Americans that somehow we had this wonderful government school system and it was just hijacked by communists or hijacked by Marxists. The reality is that it was created by communists for communist purposes. And I don't mean that in a hyperbolic sense or in the sense that everybody I disagree with is a communist. I mean, the people who created the system were literally communists. Robert Owen was such a this was before Karl Marx. In the early 1800s, he was such a dedicated communist that he set up a commune in Indiana called New Harmony to try out these crazy ideas. What happens if we don't have private property? What happens if we try to undermine the nuclear family? And as a reasonably intelligent person would surmise, it ended in disaster. It didn't even take 2 years for this colony to collapse. But the individual, Robert Owen, came away with exactly the wrong idea about what was the problem. The problem wasn't that they were violating basic fundamental biblical truths like private property, like family. He thought the problem was that these children had been raised in an environment where Christianity was dominant, where what he perceived as individualism was dominant, and that the real solution was for the government to take over education. And at the time, that was an incredibly radical idea. People don't realize that we haven't had government schools all of human existence. In fact, it's a very new thing. So he wrote these crazy essays on the formation of human character, and he actually argued that the best government would be the one that educated its citizens to be good citizens. So he wrote these crazy essays, and they made their way over to Prussia. The Prussian ambassador got hold of them. This is from Robert Owen's autobiography, from his personal account, but he says the Prussian ambassador got hold of him, took him to the Prussian dictator, and he says the Prussian dictator so approved of these ramblings about the government taking over education, the alleged desirability of that he ordered his interior minister to start setting up a government school system in Prussia. And he did, and it was the first time in history that we had education of the state, by the state, for the state, with the possible exception of fascist Sparta. And of course, Plato also advocated government education, but for 2,000 years of church history, it was always understood that parents are in charge of educating, raising, and discipling their children, maybe with a supplemental role for the church. During the Reformation, we had the church took on an increased role in education. So you start with Robert Owen, the actual communist, and then from Prussia, I should also add about Robert Owen. This idea was very unpopular at the time. Parents did not think that they needed help from the government to educate their own children. And so he set up what was described by a whistleblower as a secret society modeled on the Carbonari. The whistleblower, Orestes Brownson, eventually became a Catholic and repented of his involvement in this wicked operation. But he said, I knew of this because I was part of it. He said he was organizing a big part of the state of New York for this group. And on the surface, they had two goals. The first one was to shift public opinion, to convince the public that government should help educate their children. And the second one was to get legislators on board with this idea, or to get them elected who would support a role for government in education. And again, Orestes Brownson defected. He said the end goal was the destruction of Christianity. He said the ultimate objective of having government school was to destroy Christianity. Those were his words. And he was correct. He was absolutely correct, and he understood very well what was going on. So the idea didn't go over well in America. We were the best educated people on the planet without even a close second. Almost universal literacy, especially in our big cities, in Boston and Philadelphia. There was absolutely no need for government. There was hundreds of different private schools, tutors in all the big cities. All the church denominations had their own educational institutions, and you could even send your children there for free if you didn't have money. So there really was no need for that. But after it took root in Prussia, it was imported into the United States by another man who rejected the Bible. His name was Horace Mann. He was a legislator, an attorney in Massachusetts, a Unitarian, rejected the Bible, the Calvinistic faith of his forefathers and his parents, and decided that really we needed this new kind of universal approach to religion. He thought the Bible was kind of outdated. He actually said he wanted the Bible out of schools. Obviously, that was completely ridiculed, ignored at the time. Nobody thought you could have education without the Bible, so that didn't take place right away. But he did get himself selected as the first ever Secretary of Education for any of the American states. And I'll go on a sidetrack here. A lot of people confuse the kind of Christian schools that were set up by the early Puritans and pilgrims with public schools. They really weren't. In fact, they bear almost no resemblance to what passes for schools today. When these settlers came here, they were basically setting up a Bible colony. Church, state, was one entity, right? They didn't have a clear delineation between the body politic, the civic government, and then the church. It was really one entity. And they passed the Old Deluder Satan Act in the 1640s, where they said that Satan doesn't want people reading the scriptures because that's how he deceives them. If men don't have the scriptures, they'll be deceived by Satan. And so they said it's very important that everybody learn how to read here. So they said any town over X number of people, I think it started with 50 and then went up to 100, should hire a teacher if necessary. The community should hire a teacher if necessary to teach the children how to read. Of course, that wasn't necessary most times because children were learning how to read from their parents, from their grandparents, their aunts and uncles. But there really is no resemblance and there is no lineage between what Horace Mann was setting up and the original schools that the Pilgrims, that the Puritans were building there. So Horace Mann comes along, imports this Prussian system. Eventually he went over to Prussia to study the system, but he imports this system, and right away the quackery begins. He starts bringing in phrenology. He starts bringing in the whole word method of teaching reading, which of course doesn't work. Fortunately, they corrected that very quickly when the schoolmasters in Boston wrote an essay explaining how idiotic this whole word method was. But that's where government schools really took root in America. It started in Massachusetts. Another thing that he imported from Prussia was the idea of a state normal school, where the government would start educating the teachers, so that the teachers would go out and you'd have kind of a uniform model system. So after Horace Mann was done in Massachusetts, he went around the country like a traveling evangelist, preaching the good news of government education, and little by little, he got more and more. I think it was almost 20 years between when he succeeded in Massachusetts and when the next states followed. But gradually, he started getting more and more states that were setting up public schools. Some of them were even passing compulsory education laws. Now, don't get the idea that what's happening today is like what was happening then. Some of them had, send your kids to school for, 2 months, a few hours a day. It wasn't like, all day, every day, 5 days a week for 9 or 10 months out of the year. So they had to do it gradually because at every step of the way, the parents were resisting, the ministers were resisting. They came up with some excuses, like when the big Catholic migrations started. They said, we got to get all these Catholic children. They're going to totally change our country. We got to get the Catholic children into a government school so we can teach them Protestantism and, separate them from the ways of their parents. So they started trying to sucker the Christians into going along with this. And then after Horace Mann, he set up these systems all over the country, started getting legislatures on board. And then along comes John Dewey. Another actual communist in the truest sense of the term. This guy went to the Soviet Union and was singing the praises of the Soviet system. He was especially impressed with their so-called educational system and how it was instilling what he described as a collectivistic mentality in the children. He was a big advocate of dumbing down the children, and when you read his writings, his essays, it comes through pretty clearly. You kind of have to know how to read between the lines sometimes. Like anytime he uses the word democracy, you need to understand what he means. He doesn't mean democracy in the sense that a normal American does. He means democracy in the sense of socialism, collectivism, etc. So once you can read through and decipher what he's saying, it's very clear. He wanted to dumb down the population, and he wanted to use the public schools to turn Americans away from what he viewed as the dangerous individualism and, of course, their Christianity toward this what he viewed as a more enlightened religious system. He was one of the founders of the humanist movement, the humanist religion. Actually, they called it religious humanism. And he was one of the authors and signers of the first Humanist Manifesto. At the time, it was just known as the Humanist Manifesto. Very blatantly communist document. Starts off attacking the Bible. They say religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created, which of course is a direct assault on the first words of Scripture. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then from there, he proceeded to, him and his buddies who were working on the Humanist Manifesto proceeded to argue that we needed to get rid of the profit motive, that we needed to collectivize the means of production. I mean, it's Communism 101 dressed up as a religion.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Can you tell me because I've seen the ties between like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and John Dewey and these early educators. Can you comment on that connection?
Yeah, that's one of the things that's so interesting about John Dewey and the emergence of the public school system. Because on the one hand, you have people who say it was communists who set it up, and it was. Okay, John Dewey is really Exhibit A, open communist. You can go back and read his essays that he wrote in the New Republic about the Soviet Union, and you're just blown away. I mean, this is a regime that killed millions and millions of people, and yet you had the super capitalists of the day putting money behind him, like the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers had a foundation, I guess, at the time called the General Education Board, and they put millions of dollars behind John Dewey's efforts, back when millions of dollars was an unfathomable amount of money. And so they were funding this experimental school that he set up at the University of Chicago. In fact, one of the Rockefeller patriarchs, John D. Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller Jr. sent his children to this school. And they emerged illiterate, literally. I mean, you can read about it in their own books. They say, I couldn't read properly. Now, they were wealthy enough that they could hire secretaries to do their reading for them, so the handicap wasn't as bad as it would be for one of us who can't afford a secretary. But very, very interesting that you had the and it wasn't just Rockefeller, the Carnegies, many of these very, very wealthy families wanted to create an educational system that would basically create standardized, unquestioning, robotic worker drones. And so the communists had a vested interest in this. The humanists had a vested interest in this. They wanted to turn children away from their families, from the church, from Christianity, from their individualism. And the super capitalists had a vested interest. They didn't want these wild Americans who just thought they could solve all problems on their own, and they're independent, and they're very liberty-minded, and they want to be entrepreneurs, right? They don't want to go sit in a factory and turn a screw for 8 hours a day. They want to go out and make money or go explore or whatever. So that's where this very bizarre collaboration between communists and Marxists, socialists, collectivists with the super capitalists of the day came into being. And if you really look closely at these super capitalists, a lot of them, once they had made their money, they didn't like competition anymore. They didn't want to have to be constantly competing to maintain market dominance. It's widely reported that John D. Rockefeller is reported to have said that competition is a sin. So in that sense, maybe they shared something in common with the communists. But it's a very, very interesting story how these incredibly wealthy gazillionaires, by today's standards, worked together with communists who wanted to overthrow capitalism to create this government school system. And I would say the turning point in all of this was World War I. Up until World War I, most American children were still being educated almost entirely by their families, by their relatives, parents, older siblings, and then maybe a supplemental role for the church. And then if they did really well, maybe they go to college for a couple of years when they're 14 or 15. After World War I, they sent the men all off to die in this war that nobody really understood. Then they said, well, the women have to go run the factories because the men aren't there. Who's going to make the bombs and the planes and whatever, the weapons? And so then the children were at home by themselves, and they said, well, we got the public schools here, why don't you just send them there? And that was really a turning point in American history when the vast majority of American children then were being educated by government, and it all went downhill from there.
All right, I'm going to read this quote from Charlotte Iserbyt. This quote was made in 2012, and you know who she is.
Yep.
She said, I had access to all the computer printouts of all the grants and contracts going out, not just to our country, but all around the world, about how to change the education system from academics to a brainwashing, using Pavlovian, Skinnerian, operant conditioning computers and workforce training for the globalist economy, the corporate, fascist, socialist, communist government that's coming right in this minute. What comments do you have on that?
Charlotte Iserbyt was a very good friend. She and I collaborated a lot. I spent some time at her house. She's one of my heroes, a truly extraordinary human being. And she was so far ahead of the curve that when she started telling people this, nobody believed her. She had the document, and people didn't believe her because it was just inconceivable that the Reagan administration, right? And I'm not saying Reagan had anything to do with this. Nobody knows what's going on with, hundreds of thousands of underlings. But even in the Reagan administration, that they'd be cooperating with the Soviet Soviet Union to brainwash our children, to turn them into little Marxist zombies. It didn't make sense. It sounded so outrageous. Today, in retrospect, it's very obvious that she was 110% correct. She just was ahead of her time. But she had the proof. She had the documents, and she published them. She leaked some of them to the press. That's when she started falling out of favor, and of course they removed her from her position. But she's absolutely right. What they did was they shifted education away from education in the normal sense, the sense that normal people expect children are going to be educated, into really behavioral psychology and animal training. And this was a long process. Charlotte Iserbyt understood this too. This began long before she got involved in the bureaucracy. If you go back all the way to John Dewey, in fact, John Dewey, some of his closest collaborators and cohorts were behavioral psychologists. Many of these people were trained under Wilhelm Wundt at the University of Leipzig in Germany. And they really did have this worldview that looked at the human being as nothing more than an animal, a biological stimulus response mechanism that could be trained very much like you would train a tiger to jump through a flaming hoop at a circus. You give it positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and eventually you bring it around. And so they really viewed the human being as a kind of soulless animal, or even a meat robot. You hear the term sometimes. And of course, I think that's a very flawed and very dangerous view of the human being, but that is how the creators of this system viewed people, and that is true up to today. I mean, if you look at what's happening in schools, this is not education in the traditional sense of the term. This is behavioral training. This is basically a supercharged version of what Pavlov was doing with his dogs. And it's become very advanced with the computers that they use now. They give people, these children, automatic stimulus and responses, right? So they ask the kids, for example, their thoughts on open borders or abortions or homosexuality or transgenderism, or pick your issue. And if you have the right attitude, they call this the affective domain, right? Your attitudes, your views, your values. If you have the right ones, you get a little smiley face and a little happy music and a little confetti falls down. If you have the wrong attitude or the wrong view, so you get this instant reinforcement. Oh, that was bad. I guess I don't want that. Oh, I got a smiley face, a little shot of dopamine. And so they really are treating our children as if they were circus animals. It's incredibly dangerous, and I think the entire world owes Charlotte a debt of gratitude for having exposed this stuff so many decades ago. If we had listened then, we probably wouldn't be in the mess that we're in today.
Absolutely. In the time we have left, can you discuss the data collection and the SEL and the computerized questionnaires and all that?
Yeah, the data collection is absolutely critical to this whole operation, because they need the data to figure out whether their brainwashing is working. So they've got to have constant surveys. They've got to have constant feedback. And when you look at the amount of data that they're gathering on each other, I mean, you can go through the U.S. Department of Education's documents. They'll tell you we're gathering hundreds of different data points on every single child in the system. Everything from their dental health to their mental health to the conditions in their home, right? They ask these kids in surveys, how does your dad talk to your mom? What kind of food do you have in the refrigerator? Does anybody drink at your house? Does your dad have guns in his closet? I mean, they're gathering data on everything you could imagine, including the views of the children. And sometimes they use kind of weasel words to get it out. And even while they're gathering this data, they're manipulating the children as well. So they'll ask them survey questions like, what gender do you identify as? Male, female, bigender, trigender, transgender, well, whatever it is. So that gets these kids thinking. That that this is normal, that this must be how other people think. They ask little kids, 10, 11, 12 years old, how many sexual partners have you had? Well, what do you mean? They're 10, right? What's wrong with you? So 5, 8, more than 20. And so these little kids look at this and think, oh, well, maybe it's normal to have more than 20 sex partners by the time you're 12. And so very, very dangerous. And what they do with all this data, in addition to building these incredible profiles, these dossiers on every child, they want to use it for central planning. One of the things that's so interesting is that communism has always failed everywhere because it's preposterous. It violates all the biblical principles that God has laid out for us. But these totalitarians, they just keep coming back and say, well, this time we're going to do it right. And so now they've got it into their head that now they can collect all this data, they can run it through their algorithms, they can have the artificial intelligence analyze it. Now we're really going to know that this person should be at the shoemaking factory and this person should be a teaching teachers, by the way, are gradually being phased out. This person should be an engineer. And so they think that this is going to help them centrally plan the economy. And they say this pretty openly now, right? They call it workforce training, and they've got job tracks. And so, well, you're not all that smart. So sorry, you're going to have to be on the janitor track, or you're going to have to be on the toilet cleaner track, whatever it is. And then they say, oh, this one is unquestioningly obedient. Well, hey, he might be a good lawyer. He might be a good journalist to read garbage off the teleprompter. So very, very dangerous. And ultimately where this is going, we know because the Department of Education has put it into their own documents. I mean, for almost a decade now, they say that they're going to use all this data as the technology improves to predict the future behaviors and interests and ideas of these children. So we're headed toward, if this isn't stopped, an incredibly Orwellian future where the government, through the government school system, through the data collection, will know more about every person on this planet than even their closest loved ones, where the government will know more about your child than you, the parent, do. It's extremely troubling, and it makes me think of communist China, where everything has to be controlled, everything has to be monitored, and nobody can even think about getting out of line because they've been so brainwashed and they're so tightly controlled that it's just inconceivable that somebody would slip through the cracks. So it's the data gathering is a very dangerous element of this. It's an essential element of what's happening, and that's why I tell parents, you've got to stop them from getting this data. And they collect the data even on children who aren't in government schools. The second you're in a government program, if you're in a VPK, right, that the government's paying for your child's pre-kindergarten, all their information is getting sucked into the databases, and they're building them. Every state now has these longitudinal databases. They're interoperable. They're connecting at the federal level, and ultimately this is going to the international level.
All right, I want you to talk about the one world religion, and what the most pertinent information is on that.
So they are building a one world religion, and more they're doing it out in the open. Actually, as soon as we finish recording here, I'm going to be flying to Egypt for the UN COP27 climate conference, and one of the things that they're doing there, all these religious leaders from around the world, pagans, Christians, Jews, Muslims, etc., they're all going to be meeting at Mount Sinai to publicly repent of their climate sins, and they're going to usher in what they call the universal 10 commandments. Apparently the old 10 commandments won't work anymore because that led to climate catastrophe, and the schools are really I would say the most important mechanism, the most important vehicle that's being used to prepare the children for this one world religion. That's not just my opinion. If you examine what's happening, it becomes very clear. Let me give you some concrete examples. So the UNESCO, the UN's educational agency, is more and more standardizing education all over the world. And the Assistant Secretary General of the UN, he's dead now, but Robert Mueller, he created what he called the World Core Curriculum. He said this should be taught in every classroom on the planet. UNESCO still promotes this to this day. They've still got it on their website. He is one of the towering figures in UN education circles. And he actually admits in the foreword to the teacher's manual of this thing, you could probably get it at your local library, he says that this program is based on the teachings of Alice Bailey and the Tibetan teacher Jval Kuhl. And Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. She's not very well known to common people, but she's very, very well known to the elites at the United Nations, and even to many of the New Age people that are kind of ushering in this new religion. And the Tibetan teacher is not a Tibetan or a teacher. In fact, he's a spiritual entity that Alice Bailey claimed to be communicating with. She called him the ascended master, and there were several ascended masters she was dealing with, or that she said she was dealing with. If you read your Bible, these are, of course, demons. But they were dictating to her. They were using her as a channel to write these books. And she's got one, if you really want to see where this is going, it's called Education in the New Age. And she talks about the need for a world federation, a world government, and even a world brain. And so all of it's moving very rapidly in this direction. We see now the Catholic Church hierarchy is moving in this direction. We see a lot of the so-called evangelical leaders moving openly in this direction. In fact, one of the guys organizing this big ceremony at Mount Sinai is the leader, the Archbishop of the Evangelical Church in Finland, which frankly surprised me a little bit. One of the guys who's representing America is a leader of the LDS, the Latter-day Saints Church. And so you've got all these different religious denominations that are joining together. And for a Christian, this should be immediately apparent what's going on here. They're saying that we all basically agree, these are all just different paths to God, but any Christian who's read their Bible knows that is absolute nonsense. There's only one way to God. That is through Jesus Christ. And anybody who says you can get to God the Father through some other vehicle is teaching something different than what's written in the Bible. So if you believe the Bible, you cannot accept the basic presuppositions that these people are marketing, and yet they're coming together. And they just, a few weeks ago, had a major international ecumenical movement meeting. The Pope was in Astana in Kazakhstan earlier this year for this massive international religious thing. And what you see, before that they had the World Conference of Religions for Peace in Germany, funded by the U.S. government, the United Nations, the State Department, the Rockefellers, George Soros, and all these people. And they keep coming out with these statements that to any Christian are obviously garbage. They're saying that we all share the same ideas, the same values, and things like this, and that is simply not true. Any Christian who reads their Bible will recognize instantly that this is totally false. And it's very dangerous because they're suckering a lot of people into going along with this. And it's tragic. And I think as Christians, if you believe the Bible, if you believe that people are going to go to hell without Jesus Christ, you need to be sounding the alarm about this. It's not about being nice. If you love these people, you need to warn them. So,
is there any other things that you feel are going to be pertinent to people understanding? Again, the subtitle of my book, The Communist Takeover of Culture in the USSR, but parallels in today's America.
I'll add one more thing about this shift toward global education. Bill Gates, I call him Bill Gates of hell. So Bill Gates went over to UNESCO headquarters in 2004, I believe it was, and met with the head of the UN, and they came up with this agreement. He signed it on behalf of Microsoft, and they agreed that they were going to come up with global education standards, global curricula, global teacher training programs, global technology systems to make it all possible. Then he came back to the United States and started pouring millions and then billions of dollars into something we call today Common Core, which is being taught in every one of the states. Don't listen to your politicians. They might have rebranded it. They might have copied and pasted 98% of it and added a few sprinkles on top, but it's the same thing. And they're very open about what they're doing here. In fact, in some of their early commercials that they were putting out, I've got the videos, they're bragging that the Common Core is linked and lined up with international standards. And I'd say that way kids in Shanghai and kids in Chicago will be learning the same thing. I have a big problem with that. American children don't need the kind of indoctrination program that the mass murdering communist dictatorship gives to keep its victims in line. American children need a legitimate education that teaches them the truth, that teaches them how to think, but that's not what they're getting. So we're moving very rapidly toward a one-world educational system and a one-world religious system and a one-world government, and the critical mechanism behind all of it, and I mean all of it, is the public school system. And so I cannot urge parents strongly enough to remove your children from these indoctrination centers now. Yesterday would have been better, but it's better late than never. Get them out now, because you are essentially playing Russian roulette with your children, and you've got 5 rounds instead of 1 in the chambers. It's I know it's a sacrifice to pull your kids out. I do it myself. My wife and I, we homeschool all of our 5 children, and I know it takes hard work. It means you got to live on less money. I know all that, but there's nothing more important than the well-being of your children, and you got to get them out.